Let's start our parallel session, the number 2, the one that relates to the conservation and restoration of biodiversity in general, as well as species, habitats, and ecosystems. They explain us that we are free in handling this parallel session. We tried to give ourselves a sort of arrangement that was the same one as this is Bruna Comini speaking. I'm an ERSAF officer, ERSAF executive. This is the regional entity in charge of forestry and agriculture. We were one of the players of the Justicia 2020 project. Together with me, there is Gerald Gimpl, who is going to introduce himself. Is for the Austrian Ministry for the Climate Action, as well as Environment, Mobility, Innovation, and Technology. So, very important ministry. I'm going to speak about giving some framework on a regional level, and Gerald will try to give us a broader vision, a broader view as regards the Alpine region. We're trying to be as quick as possible, and then we'll give the floor to the 3 speakers. 2 of them are going to present some concrete actions that have been implemented as part of Justicia 2020 as regards the conservation of species and habitats, and the third one relates more. I can't remember. Gerald, could you help me? Okay, the business side, business aspects. They are a private company that conducted a European level project. We need to start saying that our session, in my opinion, and as well as Gerald's opinion, is the most challenging one, because biodiversity, conservation and maintenance and keeping biodiversity, governance and monitoring are some cross-cutting elements. They are essential, but the real core, the real gist of everything is being able to conserve the resources that we have and trying to restore them when is necessary. Let's start, because I can see that lots of people from Lombardy are here. Some guests are from abroad. Please raise their hand. Those who are not Italian, people who are not Italian, please raise your hands. I think that there are 5 or 50 people. You're welcome. And you're welcome, just not to just speak among yourselves. So there will be 2 input moments, and we'll see their contribution to our debate. Let's not forget that we are here. Everyone is here within a framework, namely the European policies, but not just them, because we have also the 2030 agenda of the UN, which is an umbrella of everything. European policies, the Green Deal, the Biodiversity Strategy 2030, the Farm to Fork. So there is a series of regulatory frameworks that we need to take into account when speaking of conservation. There is a common denominator for everyone in the Alps region. There is the biostrategy, which is a reference document, which is very important, that was born in parallel with Life Justicia 2020 project, that gives us some clear indications about preservation of species and habitats, and set some top priorities of species and habitats that we need to conserve, the ecological networks as a common elements, as well as the monitoring of the ecosystems. In Lombardy, we are in a very human area, and this is not random that Justilia 2020 was born here, because our GDP is the bigger here in Italy. We have a very high level of industry output here. So all the threats or the pressures for the space and the habitats are really relevant here in Lombardy. The loss of habitats, fragmentation, some types of pollution, soil consumption, the presence of invading species due to the connectivity with other people, other means of transport, agriculture, which is one of the main pillars of Lombardy economies, is usually intensive agriculture. We cannot hide ourselves, we cannot conceal this. So climate change, again, which is something that affect everything. So it involves new scenarios, new dynamics, with lots of extreme events that pose a threat to our species, habitats, and ecosystems, and a very strong presence of man-made activities. So lots of daily challenges, but also due to these very strong pressures, the region of Lombardy has carried out over the year lots of activities. We have a national park, 24 regional parks, 66 natural reserves, 3 state reserves, out of an area which accounts for almost 60% of the regional area. Potentially there is protection of the territory that allow us to work very well for the conservation. But we need some tools and some concrete and tangible actions. The presence of the Regional Observatory for the Biodiversity, the new task force for alien species, the conservation measures for species and habitats, the path, the prioritized action framework are paramount aspects, as well as the action plans to preserve and restore species, some feasibility studies aimed at reintroducing some species, lots of life projects, because we also need funds, we also need fundings. We don't need to put it as, last but not least, business aspects and funding aspects. We need to have some awareness of the fact that biodiversity is a cross-cutting, is a broad aspect. It's top priority. We lose more time, but today in these sessions, some players are missing, players from the economical world, from the agricultural worlds, that needs to be our first and foremost interlocutors. We need to take into account 3 different elements and ecosystemics as a whole. Knowledge, because it's a multidisciplinary knowledge. In one of the presentations, this is going to be explained better. Knowledge not just of species and habitats, but also as regards the natural processes, as well the ecological equilibrium. We need to recognize the scenarios, taking into account also scenarios and extreme events that more and more pose a threat to our ecosystem. For example, forestry landscapes, for example, the storm and the presence of the some pests that is being posing a threat for lots of forestry, for forest ecosystems. We need to have this capability to read what is there and try to foresee what is going to happen in order to adopt some strategies. The other aspect is the innovation, both in terms of new technologies as well as also, for example, we need to know better both natural resources as well as the future landscapes, the future scenarios. But innovation is also paramount for the sake of the manufacturing processes that have an impact. I'm sorry, but in any case, innovation is important. For example, in the agriculture sector, in some manufacturing processes aimed at reducing impacts as well as managing to use in a more sustainable ways natural resources. Another aspects, which is the third one on which we have been focusing, on which we should focus ourselves, is the aspect linked with the stakeholders relationships. This falls within the governance, but we shouldn't forget about it when we assess the measures aimed at preserving species and habitats, because all the different financial players, the economical players here in the territory must be engaged. This is not easy, but it is possible. We need to put a lot of efforts in this. Those that create the most of the pressures should be aware of this role, and we need to open a dialogue. We need to engage in a dialogue and to keep going on. We need lots of energies, we need lots of efforts, but we cannot do it without it. And of course, as regards the actions aimed at preserving biodiversity, okay, protected areas, we need to make them more and more sustainable management areas. We need to restore some degraded areas, protection of species thanks to dedicated projects and feasibility studies, and a theme about alien species, so the monitoring, but also prevention aimed at handling these things in a very interconnected region like ours. This is one of the most important topics. And then, as we were saying, agriculture cannot be seen just as traditional agriculture. I've seen some remarks, I've seen some messages from you. Maybe a presentation will be given later on, some insights about agriculture. We cannot think just about traditional agriculture in a territory like Lombardy, where the primary sector is one of the most important ones. We need maybe to envisage, to foresee a 4.0 agriculture, try to think about, try to come across with new productive methods, with an interconnection among cutting edge technologies. I'm sorry for these lights, for these sunshines. So this 4.0 agriculture is a possible tool that we could deploy, a possible way to have agriculture where Internet of Things and artificial intelligence can allow us to have a certain degree of output or productivity, reducing a lot, reducing the use of fertilizer, of pesticides, lesser impacts on the usage of resources for example, soil, water, and energy. So it's clear that we have lots of things that we can put forward. So I gave you some things about what we should work on, also thanks to NET 2020. And then we have the financing aspects. We need to preserve things, and we know that this is costly, this is expensive. So ordinary and extraordinary public funds, the possibility to access to extra funds all the life projects are just an example of it. Also, the Alpine spaces that you were just introduced before, we need to be able to define some certification standards, because in this way we can put, for example, the payment of ecosystems also in the facility lines, for the checklist for the facility lines for the enterprises. This could be an important element to be taken into account. So generally speaking, conservation of biodiversity is a long-term proceeding. So we need a cross-cutting approach, a multidisciplinary approach, also working on a larger scale, not just in our region, getting some external inputs outside our region is really useful, is the right way to go on this path. Thank you.
Oops. Yes. Yes, it's better. I don't know how you did it, Bruna, but I'm already blind. So thank you very much. My name is Gerald Gimpl. I'm working at the Ministry for Environment and Climate Action and Transport Technology in Austria, and I'm very humbled to be invited here and to co-moderate the session here with you. So I am working also in the Alpine Convention. We already heard before what it is and what it means, and there I'm working in the Alpine Biodiversity Board, also in the more globally in the Convention of Biological Diversity. So my perspective is more the broader one, and I will try to extrapolate what Bruna said about the region and try to say something more about the Alpine perspective, which is very important when we also speak about the region when it comes to conservation. So in the Alps, there are about 30,000 species of animals and about 5,400 plants, and 8% of them are endemic. So therefore, we have a natural treasure that it's really difficult to preserve, because we are facing habitat loss because of expanding human settlements, because of farming infrastructure. And we have the problem in the Alps that there are remote areas, but those remote areas also some wild areas, but they are pretty remote. And then we have the valleys, and the valleys face extreme pressure from humans, which means by transport, by business, by agriculture. Everything is concentrated in those valleys. And so we have those remote areas up the mountains, but there we have a lot of isolated populations of animals and plant species. And as more they get isolated, it's harder then to exchange the population. And that's where the Alpine perspective comes in play, because we are responsible that these species have the possibility to exchange, and we have to give those species the evolutionary aspect, so that we don't preserve just one habitat, but preserve the whole process that is needed to keep the wildlife. So, as Bruna already said, and that's not the Alpine perspective, it's the global perspective, we also have the climate crisis, and this is forcing the species to go higher up in elevation in the mountains. And there we have, again, the problem that the species can't get higher at one point and probably face extinction. And this climate change causes also another problem, namely the invasive species that are spreading. And these invasive species push some native species into extinction. And that's another problem that we have to solve in two ways. One way is to try to keep those invasive species from invading our ecosystem in the Alps. but also try to cut them back. And therefore, to tackle all these problems I mentioned now, the international cooperation is really crucial in the Alps. So as we heard already, there are different things going on in the Alps, like USALP, like the Alpine Convention, like Alpine Space. And we need all these platforms to do a couple of things. Like we need to share the biodiversity data. Like right now it is every country, every region is having a lot of data from biodiversity, but it's not so much exchangeable because everybody doing its own work and you can't really compare it. So that's one problem. Another problem is that there is less communication when it comes to corridors. We need to open corridors to enable species to travel between habitats. And there is something going on right now. There are the Alpine Biodiversity Board of the Alpine Convention is already planning a project about the data perspective. There are projects like Plan to Connect or AlpBioNet from the USALP that are challenging the corridors. There is for example, the Insignia project by WWF. They're trying to recover the Inn. And we need to focus on resilient ecosystems in the future, like forest and peat. And that's where another thing comes into play, which is called the nature-based solutions. So those are solutions where you restore ecosystems and like forests or peatlands that harvest or that store carbon and also do something for biodiversity. So we have this dual crisis, biodiversity and climate crisis, can be tackled by a single project. And when you zoom even more out, what's happening there, we have the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework that was implemented in December, which is very ambitious, but it's just a piece of paper right now. And we have to implement it in the next 10 years or so. And that's the biggest challenge of all. And it's really, and therefore every sector in the Alpine core and in the Alps is needed. So, and one sector is now coming really now like new into play, or is coming big now into play, and that's the businesses. On the international level, there is always there's now a big discussion how businesses can play a role to preserve biodiversity. For example, there is a new thing in Australia that calls the biodiversity credits right now. In the Kunming-Montreal framework, they are discussing right now how businesses can contribute to biodiversity, and we need the same thing for the Alps too. So every sector has to do something to preserve the biodiversity in the Alps. So in conclusion, what I want to say is that we have to work together in the Alps beyond the borders and to save the biodiversity. And therefore, our task is now to have a biodiversity message that we are working on right now, and that should have not just the Italian side, but the Alp-wide side reflect to show that it's really a Alp-wide contribution is needed and wanted from us all. So before we start with this message, we first have some inputs and some speeches. And we will start with it right now. The first speaker is Marco Torretta from the Lombardy region. And happy to hear your presentation. Thank you.